fire appears to be intentionally set.
It shook that community to the core, especially when those horrific details started to come out about what happened inside that house.
The word horrific doesn't even cover it. This case showed how the smallest, most ordinary detail can end up cracking one of the biggest mysteries wide open. It wasn't fingerprints, it wasn't a weapon, and it wasn't a witness. The clue that finally gave police the breakthrough they needed was a pizza. A plain Domino's pizza, the kind people order every day, became the key to unraveling one of Washington, D.C.'s most shocking murder cases. And once you hear how it all played out, you'll understand why investigators will never forget it. The Savopoulos family represented everything that people usually admire and aspire to. Savas was 46 years old, a successful and driven businessman who served as the CEO of American Iron Works, a large construction company based in Maryland. His wife, Amy, 47 years old, was known among friends and neighbors for her warmth, kindness, and deep commitment to her family. Together, they raised 3 children, 10-year-old Philip, who tragically became one of the victims, and 2 teenage daughters who were fortunate to be away at boarding school when the nightmare began. To outsiders, they were a picture-perfect family, successful, respected, and generous, part of Washington's upper social circles, living in a grand 3-story home valued at over $4 million. Their residence was located in an elite neighborhood surrounded by embassies, just a short distance from the official residence of the U.S. Vice President at the time, Joe Biden, at the Naval Observatory. Living with them, though only during the day, was Vera Figueroa, their housekeeper, who had been with the family for about 5 years. Vera was originally from El Salvador. She was a wife and a mother of 3 children, and she worked tirelessly to support her family, using her earnings to put her children through college. By all accounts, she had built a strong bond with the Savopoulos family and was trusted like one of their own. She was also making plans to return home to El Salvador to reunite with her family, but fate had a cruel turn in store. Vera, who had crossed borders for a better life and worked diligently for her loved ones, would lose her own life in a tragedy she never deserved. On May 13th, the day before the murders, Savas was away from home in Virginia, preparing to open a martial arts studio. He had been working on this new business venture alongside his responsibilities at American Iron Works. At around 4:45 in the afternoon, Amy called her husband. The contents of that call remain unknown, but what is certain is that by the time Savas returned to his D.C. home an hour and a half later, everything had changed. Amy, their young son Philip, and Vera had been taken hostage. Blood evidence later revealed that Philip had been attacked as soon as he entered the house, indicating that the violence had already begun before Savas made it home. What followed was an agonizing 19-hour ordeal. Throughout that night, a series of strange phone calls and instructions hinted at something deeply wrong inside the Savopoulos household. Savas contacted a man named Jordan Wallace, who occasionally did odd jobs for him, asking Jordan to retrieve a package the next morning. He also placed a peculiar call to his home security company, inquiring about how footage was stored and accessed. Around 9:14 that evening, Amy ordered 2 pizzas from Domino's. The order carried an unusual note explaining that she was caring for a sick child and could not come to the door. She asked that the pizzas be left outside, with payment and a tip provided in an envelope. The delivery driver did as instructed, leaving the food on the doorstep and noting how unusually quiet the large home appeared, with only one light glowing near the entrance. The strangeness of the situation only deepened. At 9:30, Savas left a voicemail for their second housekeeper, Nellie, saying that Amy was unwell. Vera would be spending the night, and Vera's cell phone had run out of battery. Nellie later testified that this explanation was odd, since neither she nor Vera had ever stayed overnight at the Savopoulos home. Even more disturbing was what could be faintly heard in the background of that voicemail. Screams, muffled but unmistakable, seeping through the calm words of a man forced to lie under duress.
Amy is in bed sick tonight, and she was sick this afternoon, and Vera offered to stay and help her out.
By morning, the carefully orchestrated plan of extortion was in full motion. At 7 a.m., Savas again contacted Jordan Wallace about the package. He also called the CFO of American Iron Works, urgently requesting $40,000 in cash, claiming it was for an equipment auction. Though unusual, the CFO complied, gathering the money and arranging to meet Jordan later that morning. Jordan then picked up the package containing the cash, though he would later come under scrutiny for his involvement and truthfulness about the events. Meanwhile, Amy continued to send messages designed to keep suspicions at bay, telling Nellie not to come into work. Around this time, Vera's family began to worry. When she had not returned home the previous evening, her husband and daughter went to the Savopoulos house. They rang the bell, but received no answer, though they heard the dogs barking and strange scraping noises from inside, as though furniture was being dragged. Their fears grew when Savas himself called Vera's husband, claiming that she had gone to the hospital with Amy and promising to follow up with the name of the hospital. But he never called back, because he could not. He was being forced to speak lies as a captive. Later that morning, Jordan delivered the envelope containing the ransom money, placing it on the seat of a car in the garage as instructed. At 12 p.m., a neighbor reported seeing a man with dreadlocks slip into the garage. It was unclear whether the garage door was opened remotely or whether someone inside had let him in, but the witness remembered that the door seemed to move effortlessly for the intruder. At 1:20 in the afternoon, smoke began rising from the Savopoulos residence. By the time firefighters arrived, the once quiet home had turned into a blazing inferno that would reveal one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Washington's history.
We go live. Police revealing a murdered CEO, his young wife, their little boy, and their maid, quote, bound and tortured overnight in their D.C. mansion, then the house set on fire. Who would torture and kill a mother, her little boy, her husband, and the family maid? In the last hours, the only clue so far emerges. Video from that same neighborhood revealing this mystery man shrouded in black, a hoodie covering his face. Is he the killer?
At first, many assumed it was just an accidental fire, but what awaited inside was a horror so profound that it would leave even seasoned investigators shaken. When firefighters arrived, the blaze had already spread aggressively through parts of the mansion. As they rushed inside, navigating thick smoke and burning debris, they quickly realized this was no ordinary house fire. Their discovery was chilling. 4 people, bound, beaten, and brutally attacked, their lives extinguished in an act of calculated violence. The victims were Savas, Amy, their 10-year-old son Philip, and their devoted housekeeper Vera. Each bore the marks of extreme cruelty. They had been restrained, tortured, and suffocated before being set on fire, as if the killers hoped to destroy evidence of their crimes. The scene inside the mansion painted a picture of methodical brutality. Investigators noted that all 4 victims were confined to the same room, bound and unable to escape. Philip, the youngest and most vulnerable, had been stabbed to death. Vera, who had spent her life working to provide a future for her children, appeared to have suffered a heart attack amid the ordeal, though her DNA was later found on the handle of a baseball bat, indicating that she had tried desperately to fight back. Amy and Savas had been suffocated and beaten, their final hours marked by unimaginable fear. Every phone in the home had been taken, cutting off their last link to the outside world, and one of the family's luxury vehicles, Amy's Porsche, was missing. It did not take long for that Porsche to be located. Hours later, the vehicle was discovered torched and abandoned in Maryland, another desperate attempt by the perpetrators to erase their trail. But instead of erasing evidence, they had left behind crucial clues. Inside the house, forensic specialists recovered fibers, fingerprints, and most importantly, DNA. And in the strangest twist of all, the key to identifying the suspect came not from a weapon or a personal belonging, but from something as mundane as leftover food, an uneaten slice of Domino's pizza ordered the night before. The pizza, which Amy had ordered under duress, contained DNA on the crust. When tested, it matched a man named Darren Wint, a former employee of American Iron Works, the very company where Savas was CEO. Wint had worked there between 2003 and 2005, but had since fallen into a troubled and unstable life. His criminal record was lengthy, including charges for assault, burglary, weapons possession, and even a sexual offense. The DNA discovery transformed the investigation overnight. What had been a baffling and terrifying case now had a name attached, and police across the country were put on alert. Darren Wint was no stranger to violence, but the level of savagery in this crime stunned even those who knew his past. Originally from Guyana, Wint had emigrated to the United States in 2000. He briefly enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, but was discharged during training for medical reasons. His life spiraled after that, with frequent run-ins with law enforcement. He was described by acquaintances as an angry, volatile man, prone to sudden outbursts and harboring grudges. That background fit the profile of someone capable of the kind of cruelty inflicted upon the Savopoulos family and Vera. With his DNA now tying him directly to the crime scene, a nationwide manhunt began. Investigators knew that Wint was armed, dangerous, and desperate. They worked around the clock, using surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and phone records to track his movements. One neighbor had even reported seeing a man with dreadlocks slip into the garage just hours before the fire started, a sighting that aligned with Wint's appearance. Slowly but surely, the circle around him began to close. Days after the murders, police tracked him down during an intense, multi-agency operation. Wint was spotted inside a vehicle, and law enforcement prepared for what could have been a violent confrontation. Using a tactical maneuver known as a vehicle pin, officers boxed him in safely, preventing escape. After a brief pursuit, he was arrested. At the time of his capture, he had over $7,000 in cash on him. Bundles of $100 bills suspected to be part of the ransom money extorted from Savas. When questioned about his sudden wealth, he claimed he had simply won the lottery, a weak explanation that only highlighted his desperation. For investigators, the arrest was a major breakthrough, but it also raised questions. Could Wint really have carried out such a carefully planned and prolonged crime alone? The ordeal had lasted nearly 19 hours. It involved restraining 4 people, making multiple phone calls, orchestrating a ransom delivery, and ultimately setting the house ablaze. Many within law enforcement, as well as the public, doubted that one man could have managed all of this without assistance. Yet, despite these suspicions, only Wint was charged, leaving open-ended speculation that perhaps accomplices had gone unidentified or unpunished. As the evidence mounted, the picture became clearer. Prosecutors argued that Wint was motivated by nothing more than greed. He had extorted $40,000 from Savas, and once he got the money, he had no intention of leaving the family alive to identify him. The brutality of the murders spoke to a man consumed by rage and indifference to human suffering. Investigators also uncovered troubling internet searches made by Wint in the aftermath of the killings, like how to beat a lie detector test, 10 hideout cities for fugitives, and 5 countries with no U.S. extradition treaty. These searches revealed a man who not only committed the crime, but also believed he could outsmart the justice system. At the same time, defense attorneys began building a very different narrative. Wint's legal team argued that he had been set up, lured to the house under false pretenses by his half-brother, and framed as the fall guy. According to their version, Wint's brother had invited him to help with a painting job and then tricked him into involvement. But as prosecutors pointed out, his DNA was on the pizza consumed while the family was being held hostage. His hair was also found in the house, on a hard hat in the garage, and on a knife propping open a basement window. The weight of the evidence made it nearly impossible to believe that Wint was merely a bystander. For the community, the case was as disturbing as it was tragic. Here was a family who had achieved so much, respected for their philanthropy and kindness, and a housekeeper who represented the hard-working immigrant dream, only to be wiped out in the most brutal way imaginable. The very nature of the crime, a prolonged hostage situation in a wealthy and supposedly secure neighborhood, shattered illusions of safety. It proved that violence, greed, and cruelty could strike anywhere, even in the heart of America's capital, among its most powerful citizens. When Darren Wint was finally brought to trial, the eyes of the nation turned toward the courtroom. This was not just another criminal proceeding. It was the culmination of a case that had shocked Washington, D.C. and reverberated across the country. The story had all the elements of a true crime nightmare. A wealthy family targeted in their own home, an immigrant housekeeper caught in the crossfire, ransom money, and a suspect tied to the crime by something as ordinary as a leftover pizza crust. But what would unfold during the trial revealed even more layers of strangeness, desperation, and controversy. Prosecutors came armed with a mountain of evidence. The DNA on the pizza was their most compelling piece, but it was far from the only clue. Wint's hair had been discovered in the room where the victims were held captive. His DNA was also present on a knife used to prop open a basement window, and fibers linked him to the crime scene. Investigators further pointed to the ransom scheme. Wint had obtained $40,000 in cash, and when arrested, he was still carrying several $1,000s of it. The prosecution argued that Wint had no intention of letting the family live once he had the money. His actions, from cutting the phone lines to setting the mansion ablaze, demonstrated a ruthless determination to silence witnesses and destroy evidence. But the most haunting part of the prosecution's narrative came from their timeline. They walked the jury through those 19 hours of terror, piece by piece, showing how the family had been forced into compliance. They highlighted the voicemail left by Savas, in which screams could be faintly heard in the background. They played the 911 calls made after smoke was seen rising from the mansion. They emphasized the cruelty inflicted on a 10-year-old child who had been stabbed to death, and the desperation of Vera, whose DNA on the baseball bat handle suggested she had fought to protect those she served. This was not simply murder, the prosecutors said. It was torture, it was extortion, and it was premeditated. The defense, however, attempted to paint a very different picture. Wint's attorneys insisted that he was being scapegoated. They suggested that his half-brother and possibly other relatives had orchestrated the crime, and that Wint's presence at the scene was incidental. According to them, he had been lured to the Savopoulos home under the guise of a job involving painting or drywall work. The defense tried to cast doubt on the reliability of DNA evidence, even calling it junk science at one point. In a bizarre move, they argued that Wint's DNA on the pizza was meaningless because, as they claimed, he did not even like pizza. That is not his food choice, they said, repeating the line so often that it became infamous. The argument was mocked by many as it seemed absurd compared to the overwhelming forensic evidence. The defense also raised questions about Jordan Wallace, the young employee who had delivered the ransom money. They pointed to his inconsistencies in statements, such as whether Savas had texted him on the 13th or the 14th about retrieving the cash. They noted that Wallace had even taken a picture of the ransom money to impress his girlfriend, but while these details were strange, they were not enough to implicate him. Phone records confirmed the timeline of Wallace's involvement, and investigators concluded that while he may have lied out of nervousness or shock, he was not a participant in the murders. In the end, the focus remained firmly on Wint. During the proceedings, prosecutors revealed further evidence of Wint's state of mind after the murders. They uncovered his internet searches about fugitives, extradition-free countries, and beating lie detector tests. These searches underscored a man preparing to run, not someone who had been wrongly accused. They also presented testimony from relatives who described Wint as hot-tempered, erratic, and prone to anger. far from an innocent man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, he appeared to be exactly the type of person capable of orchestrating such violence. As the trial went on, one question lingered. Could Wint have done all of this alone? Many observers doubted it. The logistics of restraining 4 people, keeping them under control for 19 hours, managing phone calls and ransom arrangements, and then setting the house on fire seemed overwhelming for a single individual. Prosecutors admitted that it was likely someone had helped him, even if they could not prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. But without direct evidence linking accomplices, no one else was ever charged. Wint remained the sole defendant, leaving speculation about possible co-conspirators unresolved. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached its verdict. In February 2019, Darren Wint was convicted on 20 counts, including the first-degree murders of Savas, Amy, Philip, and Vera. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never walk free again. For the families of the victims, the verdict brought a measure of justice, though nothing could erase the pain of their loss. Prosecutors thanked the jury for their painstaking work and acknowledged the difficulty of reliving such horrific details during the trial. Yet, even with the conviction, the case did not feel entirely closed. Many continued to believe that Wint had accomplices who had escaped accountability. The sighting of a man with dreadlocks entering the garage, the complexity of the ransom exchange, and the duration of the ordeal all fueled suspicion that Wint was not alone. But unless new evidence emerges, those questions may never be fully answered. But sadly, that wasn't the only time. There's another story that follows a hauntingly similar pattern, only this time the ending is even more disturbing. Unlike the Savopoulos case, where answers were eventually found, the Robinson family massacre still lingers in silence, unsolved, unanswered, and unsettling to this very day. Let's revisit that case now. This quiet old cabin in the woods seemed like the ultimate summer getaway, a perfect spot for peace and relaxation. But for the Robinson family, it became the setting for something straight out of a nightmare. It was the summer of 1968 when this well-off family made headlines everywhere. Not for anything good, but because they fell victim to brutal horrors in the very cabin where they were supposed to be resting. The crime was so horrific that it still shakes the officers and everyone else who knew about the case to this day. What's really interesting is that some investigators and people considered the case solved, yet somehow there's still something missing. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why. To kick things off, let's get to know the Robinson family. The Robinsons, a family of 6, were well known in Detroit's Lathrop Village, recognized for being both successful and generous. At the head of the family was 42-year-old Richard, a successful advertising executive and the owner of I Impresario magazine. His wife, 40-year-old Shirley, was a devoted homemaker, keeping everything in order at home. Their kids brought a lot of energy to the family dynamic. Their only daughter, 8-year-old Susan, 12-year-old Randall, 16-year-old Gary, and 19-year-old Richie, who was just stepping into adulthood. Now, about 10 years before the tragic summer of 1968, Richard had bought a charming cabin in Good Heart, Michigan, a peaceful, tree-filled area. This secluded spot was the perfect retreat, surrounded by stunning hardwood forests that stretched all the way to the cliffs overlooking Lake Michigan. The cabin was tucked off a scenic lakeshore road, hidden from view, surrounded by luxury lodges that blended seamlessly into the serene landscape. By the 60s, lakefront properties in Good Heart were selling for around $2,400 per foot. Adjusted for inflation, that would be about $21,090 per foot today. This made the area a prime spot for the wealthy and those looking for a private retreat. So you can pretty much guess that the Robinson family was part of that same elite group. Although the cabin wasn't completely remote because it had neighbors and a caretaker, it still offered plenty of quiet. Monty Bliss, T.H. caretaker, had built the cabins in 1956, and kept them in good shape ever since. But on June 6, 1968, the family headed out, eager to spend the summer in this peaceful, pricey getaway. Summers at the cabin had become a beloved family tradition for them, and this one was supposed to be no different. Now, before the tragedy, the Robison family didn't just vanish into thin air. In fact, on June 24th that same year, Richard Robison stopped by Monty Bliss's house to offer his condolences after the heartbreaking loss of Bliss's son in a motorcycle accident. During the visit, Richard mentioned that the family planned to be away for a few weeks, traveling to Kentucky and Florida to look for property. Later, a note found on the cabin's front door confirmed they wouldn't be back until July. But then came Tuesday, June 25th. That morning, Richard made a series of phone calls from the cabin, including one to the National Bank of Detroit, asking about a massive $200,000 deposit. Unfortunately, the deposit hadn't come through, a detail that would add to the mystery of what happened next. After that, Richard called his office, where Joseph Scolaro was running things while he was away. What happened next is still a mystery. What we do know is that Richard told a few neighbors they planned to leave for Kentucky and Florida with his family later that day. But as the evening rolled in, a couple living about a quarter-mile away heard something unsettling. Gunshots mixed with raised voices. 2 men and a woman arguing. The woman later recalled, "We heard a series of shots, one with a short pause, then 3 or 4 more. It was still light out, so we thought someone was shooting gulls on the beach." Despite this eerie occurrence, everything seemed normal in the days that followed. Then, on July 22nd, things took a grim turn. A group of women gathered for a bridge party at a nearby cabin began noticing a foul, stomach-turning smell. The odor seemed to come from the Robison family's cabin, so they called Monty Bliss, the caretaker. Since the family had mentioned their trip and hadn't been seen for weeks, no one suspected anything unusual. Bliss initially thought the smell might be a dead raccoon in the crawl space. But as he got closer to the cabin, Bliss noticed something chilling: bullet holes in the windows. Steeling himself for what might be inside, he knocked on the door. When there was no answer, he decided to go in, and what he found was horrific. A woman's body lay just inside the entrance, partially covered with a blanket and her clothes disheveled. Blood pooled around her, and further inside, more bodies were scattered, 3 in the hallway and 2 in one of the bedrooms. Bliss, shaken to his core by what he saw, immediately contacted the authorities. This grim discovery on July 22nd revealed that the Robison family had been dead for 27 days. Bliss later described how he first noticed the cabin's curtains tightly drawn, the front door latched from the inside, and a side door secured with a padlock. Everything seemed locked up tight until the truth came spilling out. When the authorities arrived, they had to use Bliss's keys to get inside the cabin. What they found was just as horrifying as what Bliss had described: 6 bodies, each in different rooms, confirming the worst. Every member of the Robison family was dead. The shattered front window suggested the attack started outside with gunshots before the killer went inside to carry out the rest of the gruesome act. Investigators pieced together that the attack began with 5 shots fired at Richard through a back window using a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle. After that, the killer entered through an unlocked door and used a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol to murder the rest of the family. As if that wasn't horrifying enough, Susan and Richard were savagely beaten with a hammer found at the scene. Shirley and the boys, Richie, Gary, and Randall, were all shot but didn't suffer the same bludgeoning injuries. Then there was the strange stuff. A partially packed suitcase was found, which didn't make sense given their travel plans. The house was still stocked with food, and a deck of cards sat on the table like the family had been in the middle of a game. It was clear they had no idea what was coming. What should have been a peaceful summer getaway turned into a nightmare no one could have imagined. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Going back to the crime scene, investigators believed one person was responsible for the brutal murders, largely because of blood-stained footprints found at the scene. Pathologists determined the family was killed roughly 4 weeks before being discovered, placing the horrific crime on June 25, 1968. The sweltering summer heat had advanced the decomposition of their bodies, making it difficult to examine the injuries thoroughly or gather significant evidence. And let's not forget, this was the 60s, far from the world of high-tech forensic tools we have today. Nevertheless, the details uncovered from the autopsies were as haunting as they come. Shirley, 40 years old, was found in the living room, lying on her stomach and partially covered with a plaid blanket. She'd been shot in the head with a .25 caliber bullet, and investigators believed her body had been staged, hinting at a possible sexually motivated crime. Richard, 42, was discovered in the hallway, sprawled over a hot air register. He'd been shot in the head with a .25 caliber bullet, but it didn't stop there. He also had blunt force trauma and skull fractures. A later autopsy revealed that before the final shot to the head, he'd been hit in the chest with a .22 caliber rifle. Richie, the 19-year-old college student, was found in the northwest bedroom, with part of his body stretched into the hallway. He'd been shot multiple times in the head, all from a .25 caliber weapon. 16-year-old Gary was found lying on his back against the east wall of the same bedroom. He'd been shot twice in the head, both times with a .25 caliber pistol. A later examination revealed he'd also been struck with a .22 caliber bullet and had back injuries. 12-year-old Randall was discovered lying on top of his father on a lavender-colored rug. His cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head, though strangely, no bullet was ever recovered. The youngest, 7-year-old Susan, was found on her back in the hallway, not far from her father. She'd been shot in the face, and a .25 caliber bullet was found in her clothing. Tragically, she also had a skull fracture, likely caused by the hammer found at the scene. At first, the authorities were at a complete loss for a motive behind the Robison family's gruesome murders. By all accounts, they were a loving, church-going family with no known enemies. The kids were well-mannered and academically successful. It begged the haunting question, who could commit such a horrific act, and why? The first order of business for investigators was to dig into any potential grudges or reasons why the Robisons might have been targeted. Their suspicions quickly turned to Richard Robison, the family patriarch. But here's the twist. If Richard was the intended target, why slaughter the entire family, including 4 children? As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Richard's seemingly picture-perfect life had some cracks beneath the surface. As mentioned earlier, Richard was the owner of Impresario, a magazine that on the outside seemed like a thriving business. But detectives soon learned that his business ventures were entangled in financial struggles. And it didn't stop there. Allegations surfaced that Richard had been running shady practices in his advertising business, allegedly prioritizing his gains over those of his clients. To top it off, rumors of extramarital affairs and inappropriate relationships with his secretaries added even more intrigue. Investigators discovered that over the past 3 years, Richard had scammed clients out of as much as $50,000, charging for ads he never ran or failing to pay for placements. He had also printed full-page airline advertisements in an Impresario without authorization, creating the illusion that his magazine was more successful than it really was. And if you're asking why? Well, Richard had bigger plans, an ambitious, almost fantastical vision of building a global network of computerized warehouses near airports, each doubling as cultural centers. For this, he needed a jaw-dropping $100 million in investments. To further achieve this dream, Richard had aligned himself with a group he called the Superior Table, a supposedly global organization dedicated to world peace and unity. Leading this mysterious group was a figure named Robert, an enigmatic presence who loomed large in Richard's ambitions. Richard even wore a St. Christopher medal inscribed with, "Richard, to my chosen son and heir, God bless you, Robert." But here's where things get murky. It's still unclear whether Robert was a real person or just a figment of Richard's imagination. On the night of the murders, Richard was reportedly expecting someone named Mr. Roberts at the Pellston airport, a name suspiciously similar to Robert. Yet this mysterious figure never showed up. Even stranger, no one from the so-called superior table came forward to inquire about the Robison family after the crime. Adding more fuel to the fire, detectives uncovered a peculiar pattern in Richard's behavior. He often checked into airport hotels for days at a time, telling his family he was away on business trips. And this begged the questions: was he meeting with shadowy associates? Was it part of his grand scheme, or was there something much darker and more secretive going on? The spotlight eventually fell on Joseph Scolaro, a 30-year-old employee of Richard Robison. Now remember, Scolaro was the last person Richard had contacted with, and he claimed to have little knowledge about Robison's secretive dealings, suggesting that the airport hotel stays were connected to a new business venture. But here's the twist. During these trips, Robison mostly stayed holed up in his room, with no visitors and no suspicious phone calls. The questions only deepened. Was Robert and the so-called superior table real or just an elaborate fabrication? And if Robison was spinning lies, what was he hiding? These mysteries remain unsolved to this day. Adding to the intrigue, whispers of mental health struggles in Richard's past surfaced, though the truth of those claims remains murky. And considering he's now dead, we may never know the truth about his shady dealings, if there were any. Then came a bombshell. Scolaro himself. It turned out he had embezzled a staggering $60,000 from Robison, a sum worth over $140,000 today. Investigators uncovered a string of phone calls between Robison and Scolaro on the very morning of the murders. Police theorized that during one of those calls, Richard confronted Scolaro about the missing money. In a panic, Scolaro allegedly left Detroit, made the hours-long drive to Goodhart, and silenced Robison before he could expose the fraud. Circumstantial evidence seems to back up this theory. For starters, Joseph was completely off the grid for a 12-hour stretch on the day of the murders. He didn't contact anyone, friends, business associates, or family, and had no alibi to confirm his whereabouts. Joseph claimed he was at a plumbing convention and meeting clients, but no one could verify his story. But even with this, some parts of the case remain murky. The drive from Detroit to Goodhart usually takes about 5 to 6 hours, yet gunshots rang out around 9 p.m. on the night of the murders. Joseph's wife later provided an alibi, saying he was at home in Birmingham around 11 p.m., which throws a huge wrench into the timeline. This inconsistency left investigators scratching their heads. But as the investigation continued, more holes appeared in Joseph's story. The authorities focused on his alibi, particularly regarding the time of the murders. Joseph initially told the police that his last conversation with Robison was on June 25, 1968, when Robison had asked about some company checks. However, further digging revealed that Joseph had recently given himself a big pay raise, boosted his expense account, and even handed out raises to other employees, all without Robison's approval. When they looked at some of Robison's pre-signed checks, they discovered Joseph had been inflating the amounts in the weeks leading up to the murders. At the crime scene, detectives found shell casings and blood-soaked footprints that pointed to the killer's presence. The investigation took another twist when they found a pair of shoes in Joseph's possession that perfectly matched the prints left behind. The catch? The shoes were spotless, clearly never worn. This was a tricky detail for the police since it didn't directly link Joseph to the crime scene, but it raised more questions. It turned out that Joseph had a habit of buying duplicate items, so the police speculated that he might have used the other pair for the murders. To make matters worse for Joseph, he failed 2 polygraph tests, and the results from a third were inconclusive. Following the brutal killings of the Robison family, Joseph suddenly found himself in control of the business, adding a final layer of suspicion. But this wasn't the only piece of the puzzle that pointed toward his involvement. investigators uncovered that Scolaro owned a firearm which, while not an exact match, bore certain similarities to the weapon believed to have been used in the murders. The two key firearms central to the case were a .25 caliber Beretta automatic pistol and a rare .22 caliber Armalite AR-7 rifle. Police records showed that Scolaro owned two of each, and he claimed that he had given one pistol to Robison and donated both rifles. But things took a dramatic turn in 1969 when witness testimonies led detectives to a private shooting range owned by Scolaro's father-in-law. It turned out that Scolaro, a former military marksman, frequented the range. There, they made a breakthrough discovery: AR-7 shell casings that perfectly matched those recovered at the crime scene. This finding was confirmed by a state police lab report, giving law enforcement the conclusive evidence they had been searching for. So in December of 1969, over a year after the murder of the Robison family, investigators presented their case to the county prosecutor, hoping to bring charges against Joseph Scolaro. However, without the murder weapons or any eyewitnesses, the prosecutor decided not to move forward, deeming the evidence as circumstantial and insufficient for a conviction. The case went cold, but the detectives didn't give up. They continued to work with prosecutors from Emmett County, where the crime occurred, and from Oakland County, where the Robison family lived, pushing to keep the investigation alive. 4 years later, in 1973, a new prosecutor, Lewis Brooks Patterson, took a fresh look at the Robison case and was prepared to pursue charges against Scolaro for conspiracy to commit murder. But just as things seemed to be heading toward a breakthrough, disaster struck. On March 8, 1973, two individuals entered Scolaro's office to collect a debt of $730. Instead, they found Scolaro dead in his chair, a gunshot wound to his skull, and a picture frame shattered on the wall. Police quickly arrived at the scene, confirming that Scolaro had taken his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The prosecutor's pursuit of justice came to an abrupt halt. On Scolaro's desk was a note, chilling in its admission. It read, "Mother, where do I start? I am a liar, cheat, phony. Any check that any of the people have with your signature isn't any good because I forged your name to it to get them off my back. I know I'm sick, but seeking help isn't going to help the people I've hurt." He added a postscript. "I had nothing to do with the Robisons. I'm a cheat, but not a murderer." But even with this statement, the case surrounding Joseph Scolaro remained full of mystery. While he insisted on his innocence, many, including the state police and the Emmett County Sheriff's Department, still viewed him as the prime suspect. No charges were ever filed against him, and with his death, the opportunity to ever get the full truth out of him vanished for good. Now things took another strange turn when, on the night of his death, an anonymous caller reached out to the detective working on the case. But it wasn't the detective who answered the phone. It was his high school-aged son. The mysterious caller simply said, "Just tell him Joe called and that he was right." The detective believed this message was likely tied to something he had told Scolaro before. "You're a good Catholic boy. It's going to eat at you until you confess." So, was Scolaro finally feeling guilty, or was this just another piece of the puzzle he'd never fully admitted to? But here's where things get even more tangled. Scolaro isn't the only name that comes up when it comes to the murders of Richard Robison and his family. Some people argue that the idea of Scolaro committing these murders doesn't quite add up. After all, it would have been nearly impossible for him to drive all the way from Detroit to Good Heart, kill the Robisons, and get back to Detroit in the time he was supposedly unaccounted for. So, was he the one who did it? Or is there another suspect? Enter John Norman Collins, a name tied to a whole different string of unsolved murders. Collins was linked to a series of killings between 1967 and 1969 in southeastern Michigan, where young teenage girls were abducted, SAE'd, and brutally murdered. He was convicted of one murder in 1970 but many believe he could have been behind other killings, making him the infamous Michigan murderer. What makes things even more interesting is Collins' connection to the Robison case. He knew Richie, the Robison family's eldest son. Both had attended the same university in eastern Michigan. But despite this connection, there's no clear reason why Collins would have targeted the Robisons. His usual victims didn't fit this profile, and there's no evidence that links him directly to the crime. As a result, many dismiss him as a credible suspect. Additionally, there are whispers around the involvement of Monty Bliss, the caretaker of Blisswood, the cabin where the Robison family's bodies were discovered. Bliss was no stranger to the property. He had a hand in building the cabin and knew the area well. Some locals in Goodhart even speculate that Bliss might have had a motive for the murders, suggesting that grief over his son's tragic motorcycle accident, which occurred shortly before the family's death, may have pushed him to seek revenge. According to this theory, Bliss, feeling wronged by Richard Robison in the wake of his son's death, took matters into his own hands. But while this theory seems plausible on the surface, it's important to note that the police never seriously considered Monty Bliss a suspect. A revenge killing fueled by grief is an understandable narrative, but it doesn't quite fit the facts of the case. And just when you think the theories can't get any crazier, here's another jaw-dropper. One theory suggests that Robison's former secretary, who later married a wealthy manufacturing mogul with rumored mafia connections in Cleveland, might be wrapped up in this mystery. Around the time of the murders, this woman had a miscarriage, and the gossip mill started churning with whispers that the baby might have been Robison's, not her 70-year-old husband's. And as if that wasn't enough, some people speculated that a family tied to one of Robison's botched business deals could have had mafia links. Marty Joe Link, the author of Up When Evil Came to Goodhart, doesn't shut down the mob theory, even saying it certainly has some validity. The weapon used in the murders, an AR-7 rifle, was considered a novelty weapon, but it was also a favorite among mafia hitmen at the time. In a shocking twist, an informant in 1968 claimed Robison owed the mob $12,000 a month and was way behind on payments. The informant even quoted someone saying, "If he hadn't withheld payments like he did, we wouldn't have wiped out the entire family." These mafia ties definitely add another layer of suspicion to the whole case. But just when the investigation hit a dead end after Scolaro's death, something strange happened. In February 1974, a state trooper found a blue 1965 Chevrolet abandoned by the side of the M14 highway. Inside the glove box, a luggage tag with the name Shirley L. Robison, Lathrop Village, Michigan. This was 200 miles away from the crime scene and 6 years after the murders. The investigators scoured the car for clues but found nothing useful. A title search revealed the car had passed through multiple owners since it was first purchased in 1966, but none of the previous owners had any idea how the luggage tag ended up in the car. Another mysterious dead end. Over the years, people have questioned why the main suspect was never charged. Some believe that Emmett County didn't want to deal with the massive costs of a trial. Others have wondered if the prosecutor had the chops to secure a conviction. Fast forward 45 years, and Detective Sergeant Jim Linderman of the Emmett County Sheriff's Office finally took over the case. Linderman explained that when a detective retires, their successor automatically takes over any unresolved cases. He mentioned that a good chunk of his evidence room is still packed with items from this case, which he calls the most critical unsolved case in the county. He and his team are still hoping for a resolution. Then, in 2018, to mark the 50th anniversary of the murders, retired investigators teamed up with a local historian and author to hold a community forum about the case. They dropped a bombshell. The mystery wasn't as mysterious as everyone thought. They confirmed that the primary suspect, the one who took his own life in 1973, just as the authorities were about to arrest him, was, in fact, the man responsible for the murders. Well, considering all the clues, it's not too hard to believe that Scolaro could have been the killer. But what do you think? Do you think he was really the one behind it? Or is there someone else who might have been involved? Maybe the mafia theory is more convincing. I want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let's discuss. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.